Good afternoon, everyone. I apologize I'm unable to be with you at this very important IRSA conference and seminar and the session on local content requirements and the experience of Indonesia, obviously. And I suppose we should talk a bit about how it pertains to the topic of the IRSA conference, which is about inequality in Eastern Indonesia. So I was asked to speak a little bit about the global experience with local content requirements and also reflect on the Indonesian experience. Now, obviously, local content requirements is not something new. We will hear probably later in some of the papers that will be presented in this session how local content requirements dates back historically even before the Orde Baru in the beginning of the Sukarno period under guided democracy. There was a lot of local content requirements, but in the post Sukarno era, in the Orde Baru era, as part, and this was not just Indonesia, many countries, as part of the import substitution industrialization policies of the 1980s, used a lot of local content requirements with the intention of developing the local industry to substitute away from imports and start producing the goods domestically, starting from assembly and then going into the backward linkages of the components and the inputs. And Indonesia at that time focused on automotive and electronics back in the early 70s till about the mid 80s, well, going into the 90s, actually. They had very specific targets for how much automotive or electronics should be produced with local content. And you started by prohibiting the import of completely built up goods that will force the first step of the localization, which is the assembly, and then going into how much local content you need to have in the assembly. Of course, the intention was to increase domestic production, substitute away from imports, and increase value added. There was also at some point local content requirements for milk, with the intention of while you can import milk powder, for every amount of milk powder you imported, you had to absorb a domestic amount of usually fresh milk. So there were also requirements like that in the agriculture sector. Now, if you ask the question, how successful was that import substitution local content requirement policies of the 70s and 80s? I would say that a lot of studies have been done on this. I think Pak Tekianwi was one of the ones who concluded that for the others, it was not so successful, except for motorcycles, where maybe because of the volume, maybe because the technology was more standardized compared to automotive, it was much easier to localize. So I would say the success story there was the motor vehicles. In motor vehicles was the motorcycles, but for the others, with some exception for motor vehicles, with a dominant Japanese multinational, Toyota, in cooperation with Astra at the time, they did develop a lot of backward linkages, but not all the way, say, to the engine. Electronics, I think we did not succeed because one of the requirements was actually on the employment side, that we did not want automation. And so back in the 70s, a lot of the semiconductors left Indonesia. So we didn't really get deep into the electronics on the semiconductor side, but on the appliances side, to some extent, there was a success. But what happened was that when we joined the WTO, we had to eliminate those local content requirements, because it was part of the trade-related investment measures agreement of the WTO, which required us to eliminate all trade-related measures that were linked to investment, such as local content, such as what we call import balancing requirements, that you can only import milk powder if you absorbed domestic fresh milk production, for instance, or you could only export if you imported. If you could only import a certain amount as long as you export. So all those requirements had to be eliminated, and and therefore, post 1995, Indonesia, I would say, adhered very much to the WTO disciplines, and did not have any much local content requirements in place. At the same time, we had the ASEAN regional agreements come in place with rules of origin, which is I would say exemplary, because they were very liberal and open. 40% of value added ASEAN as the measurement of rule of origin for ASEAN content. And that actually did lead to a lot of regional production base to be developed, including in automotive, in a lot of consumer production, and so on. Because I do think the rules of origin related to regional agreements have been important also in terms of not just local content, but regional content. So I think by and large, the WTO disciplines really discipline the use of local content requirements. And besides the WTO discipline itself, I would say that the global economic order at the time, including advanced countries, were not in favor or were discouraging the use of local content requirements by anybody, by including for developing countries at the time. So the climate, you could say, for local content requirements between the creation of the WTO in 1995 until the global financial crisis was one where local content requirements were either disciplined, discouraged, or were, in a way, politically incorrect, if you like. Because there were also studies that have shown that they have not been very successful in being able to create the increased domestic value that had been the intention of these policies. But what changed? In 2008, after the global financial crisis, a lot of countries, including advanced countries, became more protectionist, became more inward-looking. And by 2016, which is when President Trump came into office, the whole WTO and multilateral discipline was also much, much weakened. So I would say that starting 2008 onwards, and especially 2013, 14, 15 onwards, we have seen an increase in the use of local content requirements, including by developed countries. So in terms of Indonesia, we introduced the 2009 mining law, which had already introduced the notion of export restrictions, which are considered as local content requirements, because you are prohibiting the export of raw minerals to encourage not just to encourage, but to make it mandatory for downstreaming and smeltering to be the investment, to be the next step for mining concessions. So if they did not invest in smelters, at some point there was a deadline at the time of 2014. They would no longer be allowed to export the mineral ores, right? So it is a local content requirement requiring downstreaming, or you could say increasing from the raw material to increased processing to be done locally, instead of exporting raw material and the raw material is being processed in another country. So what happened was, at the same, let's just also, besides Indonesia, have the Chinese experience. So China became a member of the WTO in 2001. So they had to also eliminate the specific mandatory targets of local content requirements, but they actually replaced it with opaque requirements that still required a local procurement and production. And then they went into the Made in China 2025 more recently. And and even more recently, they are now pushing for more advanced technologies to be introduced, to be produced in China because of all the geopolitical tensions and decoupling that China has not been able to access semiconductor, the most advanced semiconductor technologies, and so on. So that's kind of just as an example of how, despite the WTO disciplines, countries did continue with local content requirements. Now, to come back to Indonesia, basically around 2009, Indonesia resumed with increased use of domestic production program again. In bahasa, it's peningkatan penggunaan produk dalam negeri. But it was not really done at least in 2009. It was done in a way which used government procurement, that any government procurement by state and state-owned enterprises had to prioritize domestic producers and suppliers. So this included also services. And there was a whole measurement done by the Ministry of Industry of which sectors had already achieved what percentage of local content, and therefore required the state as well as state-owned enterprises to procure domestically. And there was an unwritten rule that as long as the import price was only 15% more than the local price, then you should procure locally. And this did not violate the WTO, our WTO commitments, because we were not a signatory to the GPA, or the Government Procurement Agreement. So we were still allowed to impose local content requirements, if you like, in government procurement. And then in 2013, there was also mandatory requirements for oil and gas industries to procure domestic products for their inputs as well as services. And then the mining law was supposed to kick in 2014 with export restrictions for nickel and some of the other minerals starting in 2014. But this was delayed until 2019. But by 2019, you had seen a lot of investments in smelters. And especially this was deemed successful for nickel because there was a lot of investments in minerals. But more on this on the pluses and minuses of local content requirement policies. And just to note that it is a violation of our WTO commitment, because under the WTO, export bans or restrictions are not allowed except for certain exceptions. And we have been challenged, and there is a case by the EU on the export ban for mining for nickel ore. And I'm sure that Michelle is going to talk a lot about these issues later in her paper and presentation. And then let's now talk about why do countries impose local content requirements, and have they been successful in meeting those objectives? And then I'll try to conclude with some forward-looking thoughts. So basically, it's nothing that is surprising. The objectives of local content requirements are related to reducing import dependence, import substitution, and also increasing value added. And sometimes it's to develop certain sectors. You see a lot of that now, that you want to encourage specific specific sectors to be able to create a sector that will have a lot of spillovers. You see a lot of this happening now with semiconductors, as the US is moving away from concentration of semiconductors as well as critical minerals and low carbon technologies. You see a diversification away from China or China-based hubs on these sectors. And what you see happening is that countries like India, like Malaysia, giving subsidies to encourage the development of local semiconductor development. Obviously, it's not just local companies, but foreign investors to come in, like TSMC, which is a Taiwanese semiconductor company, is getting subsidies to create plants in India, in Malaysia, as well as in advanced countries. So advanced countries are also doing this. And it is encouraging foreign investment, encouraging technology transfers, as well as joint venture partnerships that will not just be about local production, but increasing the value added, increasing the R&D, increasing the advanced, going up the ladder in terms of the advancement in the supply chain. So those are kind of the typical local content requirement objectives. So it mirrors protectionist trade policies more generally. And in terms of the what do you classify as local content requirements? It's not just the input side, but also on the upstream, downstreaming side, as well as export restrictions that we talked about earlier to encourage downstream processing. So a lot of local content requirements are therefore applied to primary products such as minerals and oil and gas. And in terms of instruments, there are, so the question is, do instruments matter? And the answer is yes. You can have mandatory measures like, okay, you have to have X% local content by this date, or you are required as an oil and gas, somebody who has an oil and gas concession, to buy your pipes and your distribution pipes domestically and so on, or incentives. You get tax concessions for domestic procurement, or you get subsidies to invest for local production, or you get subsidized loans for capacity investments. That's the between mandatory and incentives. So and then you can also have supply side policies and demand side policies. Demand side policies require extractive firms, for instance, to invest in downstreaming facilities or collaborate to improve skills locally. And it is intended to promote backward linkages between mining and their suppliers, preferences for local suppliers of inputs, and downstreaming with restriction of raw materials for exports, as well as domestic market obligations, such as what we have in Indonesia for coal, and to some extent also for palm oil. So those are kind of the instruments and what we tend to think about as local content requirements. What has been the experience of all these local content requirements? In general, the results have been not positive in the sense of that these local content requirements led to the development of local industries on its own. Yeah. And the reason is very simple, that the local content requirements distorts the decision of the investor as well as the producer to procure from the most efficient, most competitive, and internationally competitive, because you are talking about also export-oriented firms, from the lowest cost producer and the highest quality. So you're distorting that decision and increasing the cost and therefore the price domestically, as well as affecting your competitiveness in exports. That's kind of the general view. And if you, it's like very much like the infant industry argument. You can do so in the interim, in say in a short period of time, with some timelines, with some sunset clause that provides, say, a 3-year or 5-year window for that particular domestic part of the value chain or of the domestic industry to become competitive. But as has been the case with infant industry, that didn't really happen. And the result has been higher cost, higher prices, and loss of competitiveness in many cases. So that's been kind of the general result. There hasn't been too much of a success story if you're just talking about the local content requirement on its own. So in general, mandatory, in terms of the instruments, incentives tend to work better than mandatory requirements, because incentives at least still have some market-based decisions in the calculation. The subsidies just reduce, or the incentives reduce the cost of making that decision, and allows for a 3 to 5 year window to be able to achieve that level of competitiveness. But still, you have to have these performance requirements, sunset clause, and target very specifically what you want to subsidize and who you want to subsidize. So the selection process is also an issue. So in general, the policies that have worked effectively have these principles. And as you can see, this requires institutions to be strong to be able to administer these policies well. And most importantly, local content requirements alone are not sufficient to be able to achieve the increase in local value added or substituting away from imports. You need complementary policies as part of a comprehensive approach to build the ecosystem, meaning the other aspects of the production, whether it's the infrastructure that's needed, or the development of the input and component industries that are needed, and the skills, the human capital that is needed to be able to have the workers, to be able to develop the ecosystem that is not just the end part of the import substitution of the value chain, but goes into the upstream, the downstream, as well as the also potentially in the upstream, in the development of the materials that are needed for you to be able to have increased value added domestically. And so the other thing, especially with extractive industries, is that whether the cost and benefit of these local content requirements also needs to take into account the environmental costs as well as the social impact. And this is where I think that the theme of this conference in relationship to what's happening in Eastern Indonesia becomes very relevant, because a lot of the extractive industries which are now being subject to these local content requirements for downstreaming is happening in the Eastern Indonesia, in Sulawesi, as well as in Maluku. And while let me just close on a few forward-thinking thoughts. I think we understand kind of the political economy of local content requirements, and the fact that now there is the WTO multilateral discipline on this is much weakened, so that many countries, including advanced countries, are using them. And this includes obviously the US with the IRA, which is the Inflation Reduction Act, which is providing subsidies for American companies and any company that wants to invest in the US, as long as they procure domestically and they procure from allies or friends. And this is where the regional agreements and the rules of origin and the regional content become an issue. But they clearly want to decouple away from China. So within that requirement, there are requirements that it should not come from China. It should also not come from companies which are not based in China, but have dominant Chinese ownership. They call it foreign entities of concern or countries of concern. So it means that there has to be diversification away from China dominance, right? And this is where I do think, in terms of how Indonesia should perceive this as an opportunity, if we do want to attract the diversification of investments, whether it's in the processing of the critical minerals into batteries, electric vehicles, or any of the low carbon technologies, we have to do a couple of things. One is, of course, to ensure the enabling environment for investments. Second, we have to make sure that we've developed the infrastructure and the ecosystem that will allow deepening of these supply chains. For instance, if you do want to make batteries or electric vehicles, or even attract data centers, you do need clean energy to power these investments. So then it leads you into the question of how are we going to be able to achieve energy transition will be very important as part of the ecosystem. Third is to make sure that the environmental costs are being addressed, and that we are not doing extraction at the cost of the environment or at the cost of local livelihoods, whether it's the fishermen who get the waters being affected by pollution, or other aspects of either social or ecological impact from these investments. And this will be a very important topic for the inequality question of Eastern Indonesia. So how do we make sure that the spillovers locally, especially in the more remote and underdeveloped areas, do happen with these policies? And finally, on the regional side, I do think we need to really think about how our regional agreements, whether it's the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership of East Asia, or whether within ASEAN itself, or ASEAN plus one, with dialogue partners, or with our FTAs with Japan, with Korea, with Australia, we can develop regional supply chains with regional content that will address the geopolitical concerns about dominance of Chinese content. I believe we cannot totally decouple from Chinese content, but we can reduce the Chinese content and increase the other regional content, which may or may not satisfy what the US is going to require in terms of regional content or local content a la US, or regional content a la friends and ally shoring. But in any case, this will address some of the issues either facing the US, and of course we do not know. There's a big uncertainty about what the US policy will look like after the elections, whether under Trump, how is it going to differ? We think it's going to be very different compared to Biden, for instance. But other than having to serve the US market, there's the European market and our own very big regional market where we can really develop the regional supply chains. So I think we need to go back and make sure that when we are doing the local content policies, we are aware that it can't just be local content policies on its own. You need the complementary policies, you need to have a comprehensive approach, and you need to adhere to the principles of good policy, which is, how do you target effectively? How do you make sure that you look at all the costs and benefits? How can you target and pick those who will get the benefit, whether it's an incentive or whether it's the ones that will be given the exceptions, that are done in a very transparent way. And there, I think, should be a sunset clause and performance requirements related to any of these mandatory requirements or incentives. And we should continue to review and keep track and monitor all these impacts. So that's all from me. I apologize that I'm actually speaking from Labuan Bajo on a boat, and I'm hoping that this recording will work to reach you for your session later. So I wish you all the success for this IRSA and IBER session, and hope to hear many good inputs coming back from this session. Thank you so much.